The humans are weak. Destroy them all.
Activate the third moon defenses. All ships, fire at will.
Every alien child in the Threxil Hierarchy is taught one rule before they are taught to read. Never wake a sleeping human fleet. They are not told why. Most of them never ask. The rule is simply there, passed from parent to child, the way other species teach their young not to touch fire. For 300 years, the Threxil Hierarchy conquered without pause. 900 systems bent beneath their banners. 40 species now serve inside their empire, quiet, obedient, erased of their old names. Every empire they touched, they broke. Every empire they broke, they absorbed. Only one border was never crossed. Human space sat at the edge of Threxil maps, marked in a color reserved for territories the Empire chose not to touch. Not because humanity was strong, not because humanity was feared, in the way the Threxil feared real threats. Because of a story told to children at bedtime, half legend, half warning, about a war fought a century ago that ended so quietly the hierarchy's own historians argued for decades over whether it happened at all. The official record said humanity had been offered peace and had accepted it gratefully, relieved to avoid a war it could never win. The story told to children said something else. It said the hierarchy had sent a fleet into human space once, long ago, confident and unafraid. It said none of that fleet ever came home. It said the humans never celebrated the victory, never announced it, never used it to demand tribute or territory. They simply let the hierarchy believe what it wanted to believe and went back to sleep. The hierarchy's own archives held a fragment of the truth, buried so deep that only a handful of historians had ever bothered to read it fully. A single survivor's account, recorded a century earlier by a communications officer named Threll Van, the only member of that original invasion fleet ever recovered alive. His testimony, filed and largely ignored, described not a battle but an unveiling. Ships appearing from places his own sensors had scanned as empty 100 times before. Weapons that struck with a precision no doctrine could explain. And strangest of all, mercy shown to prisoners by an enemy that had every reason, by Threxil standards, to show none. Van's account ended with a single line that later historians dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized survivor. They were never hiding because they were afraid of us. They were hiding because they were waiting to see if we deserved what came next. The hierarchy filed the account, buried it beneath a century of official silence, and taught its children a simplified rule instead. Easier to teach a warning than to teach an entire empire humility. Grand Overseer Kaelith Thorn did not believe in bedtime stories. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Absolute Judgment, watching a tactical display that showed 60 human patrol vessels near a border colony called New Meridian. Old ships, slow ships, nothing that matched the terror children were taught to feel. 60 ships, he said, guarding an entire system. His fleet commander, a sharp-eyed officer named Threxil, nodded beside him. Their records list nothing larger deployed to this sector in 40 years. And yet no one has tested that border in 300 years, Thorn said. Not once. Superstition, Ilarion said. The hierarchy conquered 900 systems on strength, not folklore. Thorn said nothing. He had heard the story as a child, the same as every other Threxil citizen. He had dismissed it as a child too, the way children eventually dismiss most warnings meant to keep them safe. Now, staring at 60 aging ships guarding a border the hierarchy had circled around for 3 centuries, some old, uneasy part of him wondered if dismissing it had been the mistake every generation before his had made. He gave the order anyway. Prepare the invasion fleet, Thorn said. 20,000 vessels, we end the legend today. 20,000 Threxil warships began their advance toward human space, carrying soldiers who had grown up hearing the rule and were now, for the first time in 300 years, about to break it. None of them knew they were not invading a quiet border colony. They were walking into the one place in the galaxy where the sleeping fleet had never actually stopped watching. 60 light-years behind the advancing armada, on a Threxil core world called Asenath, a young archivist named Farron Dale pulled the century-old survivor's account from a restricted database, simply out of curiosity, the night before the invasion fleet departed. She read Threll Van's testimony twice, uneasy in a way she could not fully explain, and flagged it for her supervisor's attention with a short note attached. Has anyone actually verified this was superstition, or did we just decide it was easier to believe? Her supervisor never opened the file. It sat in a queue unread, while 20,000 ships crossed into human SB. Ace carrying an empire's confidence, and a child's warning it had never quite managed to unlearn. Phase 1 complete. Grand Overseer Thorn gave the order to advance, and the Threxil Armada moved into human space like a tide no one had ever tested. 60 ships and a handful of orbital platforms, Ilarion reported. New Meridian's entire defense grid, confirmed by 3 separate scans. Continue the advance, Thorn said. Full speed. I want this system secured before their central command even finishes processing the alert. Junior officers across the fleet exchanged confident glances. 20,000 warships against 60 patrol vessels was not a battle, it was an execution. Some of the older crew are nervous, Ilarion admitted, lowering his voice. The stories again. The stories are 300 years old, Thorn said. Humanity has had 300 years to grow soft behind a legend they never had to defend. Legends do not stop plasma cannons. He almost believed it. Aboard one of the escort cruisers, a young weapons officer named Threxil ran his targeting systems through their final checks, hands steady despite the whispers he'd grown up with. My grandmother told me this story every year, he said to the officer beside him. Said her grandmother told her the same thing, never wake a sleeping human fleet. Your grandmother also believed in luck charms, the other officer said, laughing. We're not children anymore, Threxil. Threxil laughed too, though it came out thinner than he intended. Down the corridor, an older gunnery chief named Dissarin Vul overheard the exchange and said nothing, though his hands paused briefly over his own console. He had heard the same story from his own grandmother, decades before Threxil was born, and had spent an entire career quietly wondering whether dismissing it as a young officer had been wisdom or simply convenience. He said nothing about it now either. There would be time enough, he assumed, to be wrong about it later, if he was wrong about it at all. The Threxil fleet crossed the outer edge of the new Meridian system, engines burning white against a field of quiet, ordinary stars. 60 human ships held position near the colony world, making no move to retreat, no move to call for reinforcements that anyone could detect. They're not even attempting evasive maneuvers, an officer reported, disbelief edging into his voice. It's as if they already know how this ends. They know they're outnumbered 300 to 1, Thorn said. There's nothing to evade. Begin bombardment sequencing on the colony's primary shipyard. On New Meridian's surface, in a command bunker built into the planet's bedrock, a woman named Fleet Admiral Naomi Ake watched the same approaching fleet on her own display, her expression calm, almost bored. 20,000 ships, an aide said, voice tight. Admiral, that's the largest force the hierarchy has fielded in a documented conflict in 2 centuries. I know, Ake said. I read the same projection you did 6 years ago when we first started tracking Threxil border activity. They think we have 60 ships, the aide said. They think a lot of things, Ake said, none of them accurate. She reached for a comm panel that had not been activated in 300 years. Since the last time this exact scenario had been rehearsed, refined, and quietly buried in a legend no one outside human space was meant to fully believe. "Wake the fleet," she said. Beyond the bunker, in New Meridian's largest city, ordinary life continued in careful ignorance of what was approaching. In a small home near the colony's central market, a retired shipyard technician named Daniel Wren watched the morning broadcast, unaware that the fleet he had helped build decades earlier was minutes from its first true test. He had signed the same oath as thousands of others on the project, decades before, and kept it even after retirement, even when his own granddaughter asked why he never talked about his old work. "Grandpa, what did you actually build?" she had asked him only a year earlier. "Something for a day I hoped would never come," he had told her, "but that we had to be ready for anyway." He had no idea that day had already arrived. The broadcast anchor spoke calmly about routine border activity, unaware, like most civilians across human space, that the largest battle in 3 centuries was about to begin above their heads. That too had been part of the plan. Panic helped no one. A calm, uninformed public could not leak a secret it did not know existed. Deep beneath the surface, Ape thought briefly of her own mentor, a woman who had spent 40 years overseeing the Long Watch without ever seeing it activated, who had died 5 years earlier still believing she might have wasted her career on a threat that would never actually arrive. "You would have liked this day," Ape said quietly, to no one in the room but herself. Her aide glanced over, unsure whether he had been meant to hear it. Ape said nothing further, straightened her uniform, and turned back to the tactical display, where 20,000 Threxil warships continued their slow, confident advance toward a trap 3 centuries in the making. Phase 2 complete. The Threxil fleet crossed into New Meridian's inner system, confidence hardening into something close to boredom. "Colony shields at minimum strength," an officer reported. "Their shipyard has no active defense response." "As expected," Thorn said. "Continue bombardment approach." Then the space around New Meridian's third moon folded open like a wound. Warships, not 60, not 600, thousands of them sliding out from behind a moon that Threxil scans had logged as an uninhabited rock for 300 consecutive years. "Sensor error," Ilarion said immediately. "Recalibrate, that reading cannot be accurate." "It's not an error," the sensor officer said, voice climbing toward panic. "New contacts confirmed, 2,000, 3,000, still rising." Thorn stared at the display, the old childhood warning surfacing in his mind before he could stop it. "Never wake a sleeping human fleet." "Impossible," Ilarion whispered. "We scanned that moon on approach. There was nothing there." "There was nothing there because they built it to look like nothing," Thorn said, understanding arriving with cold, unwelcome clarity. "For 300 years." Human warships opened fire in the same instant, a single coordinated volley that tore through the Threxil formation's outer edge like it was paper. Sarix Val, watching from his console, saw 4 escort cruisers lose power within seconds of each other, their crews barely able to issue a distress call before their systems went dark. "They're not firing randomly," he said. "They're hitting exact points. Every shot lands somewhere critical." "That's not possible against a target this large," his commanding officer said. "No one calculates a strike that precisely without decades of preparation." Ilarion pulled up the hierarchy's own founding doctrine on his console, words carved into the Empire's earliest war charters, memorized by every cadet before they ever set foot on a warship. "Superior numbers guarantee inevitable victory," he read aloud, voice hollow. "That's the first line every officer learns. It's the first line I taught my own cadets." "Doctrine assumes numbers translate directly to strength," Thorn said. "No one ever wrote the version where the enemy's hidden numbers exceed our visible ones." Around them, 3 more Threxil cruisers lost power within the same minute, their crews staring at weapons that fired true and struck nothing that mattered. Absorbed by shields, their own scientists had called generations away from Threxil capability. 3 centuries of unbroken doctrine had never once accounted for an enemy who simply refused to be seen, until the exact moment being seen no longer mattered. "Maybe they've had decades," Sarek said quietly. "Maybe they've had 300 years." Across the Threxil formation, panic began to spread faster than any officer could contain it. Ships that had crossed into human space expecting an execution now found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy whose full strength had been hidden in plain sight since before any of their grandparents were born. Then came a second impossible reading, one that broke something in Ilarion the first reveal had only cracked. Threxil sensors, scrambling to reassess the threat, picked up energy signatures from the human ships that matched no known power source in the galaxy. Not fusion, not antimatter, but something else entirely, a design the hierarchy's own scientists had spent centuries insisting no species outside their bloodline could ever develop. "They're reactors," a science officer stammered, staring at his readings. "They're running on a design we don't have, a design we've never even theorized." "That's not possible," Ilarion said, the phrase becoming a refrain he could not stop repeating. "Grand Overseer," the science officer continued, "if these numbers are accurate, their ships have been outperforming ours in raw power output for at least a century, possibly since the war we were taught to forget." Thorn said nothing. He simply watched the numbers confirm what the wreckage around him had already made clear. The hierarchy had never been fighting an equal. For 300 years, quietly, without a single confirmed sighting, humanity had been ahead. Then came a third reveal, and this one arrived not from the battle itself but from a single archival query, routed automatically through the fleet's tactical network, the moment the ship registries began matching against hierarchy records. "Grand Overseer," a communications officer said, voice unsteady, "one of the human dreadnoughts just transmitted an open, unencrypted identification signal. It's not military code. It's a name." "Read it," Thorn said. "Threll Van's Vindication," the officer said. "Grand Overseer, that's the name of the survivor. The one from the account nobody verified before this invasion launched." Thorn felt something cold settle behind his ribs, a feeling he did not have a word for in any Threxil dialect he knew. "They named a warship after the one man who told us the truth and was ignored for it," he said quietly. "They knew we would eventually come back. They named a ship in advance, for the day we finally listened to what he tried to tell us and didn't." "Grand Overseer," Ilarion said, voice hollow, "orders." Thorn did not answer immediately. He watched a human dreadnought glide through the wreckage of what had been, minutes earlier, one of his proudest cruisers, moving with a patience that felt less like combat and more like a lesson being delivered. "Hold formation," he finally said. "We came here to end a legend. We will not run from it before we understand what it actually is." Phase 3 complete. Deep beneath New Meridian's surface, Admiral Ake watched the battle unfold with the same calm she had shown since the first Threxil ship crossed the border. Beside her stood an older man in a faded uniform, General Adrian Cole, one of the last living officers who had helped write the original defense doctrine for this exact scenario, decades before Ake held her rank. 300 years, he said. "I never thought the legend would actually be tested in my lifetime." "It was always going to be tested eventually," Ake said. "Legends only survive as long as no one calls them a bluff." On the tactical display, 3 more hidden fleets emerged from positions the Threxil had scanned and dismissed 100 times over. One from beneath the ice crust of New Meridian's 4th moon. One from inside, a dead asteroid field that had been logged as harmless debris for 3 centuries. one from a shipyard disguised as an abandoned mining platform on the system's outer edge. Total confirmed human strength, an officer reported. 14,000 warships, 15,000, still rising, Admiral. Cole allowed himself a rare, tired smile. They called the original plan the Long Watch, he said. 300 years of quiet construction, hidden behind a single old war and the legend it left behind. He pulled up an old, grainy image on a side display, a photograph from the project's earliest days, engineers standing in front of a single unfinished hull lit by temporary floodlights, faces long since forgotten by anyone but historians. That's the first ship laid down, Cole said. 311 years ago, back when human orbital defense consisted of little more than a handful of aging satellites. Nobody in that photograph is still alive. Ape studied the image, faces she had only ever seen in briefing archives, never in person. They started before anyone even knew who the enemy would eventually be, she said. That was the hardest part to explain across 3 centuries of changing leadership, Cole said. How do you justify a burden this large for an enemy you cannot yet name? Every generation, someone in authority asked whether it was worth continuing. What changed their minds? Ape asked. Nothing changed their minds, Cole said. We simply outlasted the doubters and trained the ones who came after to believe in something they had never seen tested. That is the actual secret, not the ships. The discipline to keep building something that might never be needed. How close did we come to being found across 300 years? Ape asked. Cole considered the question carefully before answering. Several times, a Threxil probe passed close enough to one of our hidden shipyards that discovery was a real possibility. Each time our countermeasures held. Each time we improved the cover a little more, so it would hold the next time too. And if it hadn't held, Ape asked. Then the Long Watch would have ended the same day it was discovered, Cole said. That risk was accepted at the very start, generations before either of us was born. We were never building a guarantee. We were building the best possible chance. A younger officer near the back of the room, one of the few in the bunker not yet 40, finally asked the question everyone else had learned not to voice aloud. Admiral, why let it happen today? He said. We could have kept building, kept hiding. Why let the legend finally get tested at all? Ape turned to face him, the wreckage still burning on the display behind her. Because a legend only protects you as long as no one tests it, she said. The Threxil were always going to come, eventually. We didn't choose this day. We chose to be ready for whichever day it turned out to be. And if they'd never come, he asked. Then 300 years of work would have simply been the reason peace lasted, Cole said. That would have been a fine outcome too. We just never got to celebrate wars that didn't happen. The younger officer nodded, chastened, and returned to his console, watching the battle map where the human wall closed tighter, methodical, patient, exactly as it had been drawn on strategy boards generations before he was born. How did it survive that long without discovery? Ape asked, though she had read the files 100 times before. The same way any secret survives centuries, Cole said. Nobody who knew the truth ever needed to tell it. Every generation simply passed the responsibility to the next, the same way the Threxil passed down their warning not to test us. He gestured at the display, at the wall of human ships now closing around the Threxil formation from every angle. They taught their children to fear us, Cole said. We taught our children to be ready in case that fear ever wore thin. On the battlefield, Threxil communications flooded every channel, confused orders overlapping desperate ones. Regroup at Rally Point 2, one captain screamed into his comm. Rally Point 2 no longer exists, another voice answered. It's under fire. Grand Overseer Thorn stared at the growing wall of human warships surrounding his fleet. A tactical picture that no briefing, no doctrine, and no childhood warning had ever fully prepared him to face. 20,000 Threxil ships, already bleeding losses by the thousand. 15,000 human ships, and still rising, still emerging from hiding places 3 centuries in the making. For the first time since the hierarchy's founding, its war council faced an enemy that could match it, ship for ship, on the exact day that enemy had chosen to prove it. "Pull the second wave back," Thorn ordered, his voice flat with the effort of controlling it. "Reform at grid formation 7. "Grand Overseer," Ilarion said, voice breaking for the first time in his career. "The hierarchy does not retreat. It has never retreated in 300 years. "The hierarchy has never fought this," Thorn said. "Reform, now, or there will be no hierarchy fleet left to retreat with." Phase 4 complete. The human fleet did not wait for the Threxil to reform. Admiral Ake gave a single command from beneath New Meridian's surface, her voice steady and final. "All fleets, advance, full offensive, execute long watch protocol." 15,000 human warships surged forward as one, closing like a fist around the Threxil's broken formation. What had been a defensive trap became a methodical assault. Human strike carriers launched fighter swarms in numbers the Threxil had never accounted for in any projection. Heavy cruisers opened fire with weapons built from technology the hierarchy had never once detected across 300 years of quiet border surveillance. A single human dreadnought, the Long Watch's answer, tore through the center of the Threxil formation, its hull absorbing return fire without visible damage. Its main cannon fired once. 3 Threxil battleships lost power in the same second, their reactors overloaded by a weapon system the hierarchy's own scientists would spend years trying to understand. "Central formation is collapsing," an officer shouted, watching his display fracture into red. "We're losing the middle line completely." Thorn watched his tactical display fill with wreckage markers, not scattered losses, but structured losses, cut with a precision that suggested rehearsal rather than improvisation. "They're not fighting like a young species defending its home," Ilarion said, disbelief thick in his voice. "They're fighting like veterans of a war we didn't know we'd already started losing." "Because they are veterans," Thorn said. "We simply never saw the war they were already preparing for in simulation for 300 years. Sarix Vol watched from his crippled cruiser as an entire wing of Threxil ships tried to break for open space, and found the gap already sealed by human interceptors, waiting in exactly the position their retreat pattern demanded. "They knew we'd run this way," he said quietly. "Like they've fought this exact battle 1,000 times before, against a version of us that doesn't even exist yet." Aboard the Long Watch's answer, Fleet Captain Marcus Idhan watched the battle unfold from his command chair, cross-referencing live enemy losses against numbers calculated years earlier during officer training. Projected losses at the 2-hour mark were 9,400, his tactical officer reported. Current confirmed losses, 9,100 and rising. "Close enough to trust the model," Idhan said. "Continue the pattern, do not improvise." Far across the battle line, Fleet Commander Priya Nakamura led the fleet hidden beneath the 4th moon, 4,000 ships that had waited in silence for 3 centuries, into the widening gap on the Threxil's northern flank. "Confirm target lock on their command cluster," she said, watching 6 Threxil cruisers try and fail to reposition in time. "Yes, locked," her weapons officer replied. "They're not maneuvering like a real formation anymore, Commander. They're just trying to survive." "Then make it quick," Nakamura said. "There's no honor in dragging this out longer than it needs to." Her fleet fired in a single coordinated volley, a maneuver rehearsed so many times in simulation that her crew executed it without a single spoken order beyond the first. 4 Threxil cruisers went dark within seconds of each other. On New Meridian, Ape watched the battle map turn from crimson to a steady, advancing blue sector by sector, ship by ship. Enemy formation broken, an officer reported, voice tight with controlled excitement. Threxil main fleet retreating toward the system edge. Confirmed losses exceed 11,000 vessels. Do not let them regroup, Ape said. Advance to system edge, hold nothing back, let them see everything we built. Across the system, what remained of the hierarchy's once proud armada broke into smaller and smaller fragments, each one hunted down with the same calm, patient precision as the last. Inside the closing pocket, a Threxil heavy cruiser named the Endless Hunger, one of the fleet's oldest and most decorated vessels, attempted a final desperate maneuver, angling toward what its captain believed was a gap in the human line. There was no gap. There had never been a gap. Fleet Commander Nakamura's wing had been holding that exact position for 11 minutes, waiting for precisely this move. Target acquired, she said. They think that's an opening. It's not, her weapons officer said. No, Nakamura agreed. It's where we wanted them to go. Her wing fired in unison. The Endless Hunger, veteran of a dozen prior Threxil conquests, went dark in under 4 seconds. One more name added to a list of legendary ships that would never sail again. Aboard the Long Watch's Answer, Captain Eidhen watched the last major concentration of Threxil firepower collapse into scattered, disorganized fragments. Command structure among enemy remnants has broken down, his tactical officer reported. They're not receiving orders from the flagship anymore, just running. Then let them run, Eidhen said. A fleet that runs tells a better story than a fleet that dies fighting. We want the story told. Elsewhere on the southern flank, Fleet Commander Diego Marchetti, a grim and quiet officer commanding the shipyard fleet disguised for centuries as an abandoned mining platform, closed the last open corridor a Threxil ship might have used to escape uncontested. Southern flank sealed, Marchetti reported to new Meridian command. Nothing gets out of this pocket that we don't allow to. Copy that, Ape answered. Hold position and let the pocket collapse on its own. No need to rush what's already decided. Marchetti watched his own tactical display fill with the same wreckage markers spreading across every other sector. Thousands of Threxil ships now trapped inside a fist that had been closing, patiently, since before he was assigned to this command. Feels strange, his weapons officer said. All those years drilling this exact maneuver and it just works, exactly like it was supposed to. That's the whole point of 300 years of drilling, Marchetti said. It's supposed to feel strange when it finally works. Means we did it right. Phase 5 complete. Grand Overseer Kaelith Thorn stood alone on the bridge of the Absolute Judgment as his fleet burned around him. The viewport filled with drifting wreckage that used to be an invasion force 3 centuries in the planning. 12,000 Threxil ships destroyed outright. 5,000 more crippled and drifting, beyond saving, beyond retreat. 300 years of hierarchy expansion, halted in a single afternoon by a species his own briefings had called a fading legend. Grand Overseer, Ilarion said, voice hollow, standing amid a bridge crew too shaken to speak. Orders. Thorn stared at the tactical display, watching every human ship move with unnerving precision, like pieces of a single machine built and tested across 300 years of patient, quiet preparation. They let us come, he said quietly. The legend was never a warning meant to scare children. It was a description of exactly what would happen if anyone ever ignored it. He thought of every briefing that dismissed the story as superstition, every officer, including himself, who had laughed at the idea of an enemy strong enough to end a Threxil invasion without ever announcing the victory. They studied our doctrine for 3 centuries, Thorn said, watching a human dreadnought glide past the wreckage of his escort ships, unhurried and certain. Every conquest we made against other species taught them exactly how we would eventually come for them. That's not possible, Ilarion said, gripping a console that no longer showed a single functioning weapon system. No species plans 300 years ahead for a W. Or that might never come. Humanity did, Thorn said. Humanity does. He remembered, distantly, a line from the old legend his grandmother used to tell him, one he had always assumed was simply poetic embellishment. They do not sleep because they are weak. They sleep because waking costs something, and they intend to spend it only once. He understood now that the line had never been poetry. It had been a warning, stated as plainly as the hierarchy's own historians ever allowed themselves to state anything about a war they had chosen to forget. A final wave of human fighters passed within visual range of the Absolute Judgment's bridge, close enough that Thorn could see their hull markings, close enough to know they could have fired and chose not to. "They're letting us leave," Thorn said, understanding settling over him like cold water. "They want the hierarchy to carry this story home." "Why would they want that?" Ilarion asked. "Because a defeated enemy who runs in silence teaches nothing," Thorn said. "A defeated enemy who runs in terror and tells everyone why teaches an entire empire to remember a lesson it should never have needed a second telling." He watched the last functioning Threxil ships form a ragged retreat line at the system's edge. "We didn't find a fading legend," Thorn said. "We found the reason the legend was still being taught 300 years later, and we ignored it anyway." Across the shattered Threxil formation, surviving captains echoed the same realization on every channel, voices flat with the particular exhaustion of watching a certainty collapse in real time. The great and ancient Threxil Hierarchy, conquerors of 40 species, had not discovered humanity's weakness. They had discovered exactly why the rule existed, and exactly what it cost to break it. "Signal full retreat," Thorn said. "All surviving ships jump out immediately. Do not engage further." "Grand Overseer, the hierarchy does not." "The hierarchy," Thorn said, cutting him off, "has never met this enemy in 300 years of pretending it did not exist. Retreat. Now, while there is still a retreat left to make." Sarix Val was pulled from his dead ship by a human boarding team 20 minutes later, expecting execution and finding instead calm efficiency. No one shouted. No one gloated. A human officer studied his uniform insignia, then spoke through a translator device built specifically for this exact conversation, refined across generations of preparation for a day its designers were never certain would come. "Weapons officer, second class," she said. "Young, scared probably, though you're hiding it well." Sarix said nothing, unsure whether silence or honesty was safer. "You'll be treated fairly," the officer said. "That was decided a long time ago, long before you were born, by people who understood that becoming what you fought would be its own kind of defeat." He stared at her, uncomprehending. His own empire had absorbed 40 species and shown none of them this particular mercy. "Why would you prepare kindness for an enemy you hadn't even met yet?" he finally asked. "Because keeping a fleet hidden for 300 years only works," she said, "if you also decide in secret who you intend to be on the day you finally have to use it." She turned and walked away, leaving him with a question the hierarchy's entire history had never once required it to ask itself. Elsewhere on the Absolute Judgment, a young medical officer worked to stabilize wounded crew pulled from the wreckage of 3 different ships, none of whom had expected to need her services against an enemy their own briefings had called a fading legend. "They keep asking the same thing," she told a colleague quietly between patients. "Not how did we lose? Why didn't anyone warn us this was real?" "Someone did warn us," her colleague said. "Every one of us heard the story as children. We just decided together that it couldn't possibly still be true." Phase 6 complete. 2 hours after the first shot, it was over. 20,000 Threxil warships had entered New Meridian's system with total confidence, expecting to end a legend in an afternoon. Fewer than 5,000 escaped, limping toward hierarchy space carrying wounds no Threxil fleet had suffered in 3 centuries of unbroken conquest. On New Meridian, Admiral Ape stood in the command center as officers embraced around her, junior crew weeping openly with relief after years of silent preparation finally paying off. She did not celebrate. She watched the wreckage field on the display, where the legend humanity had allowed to grow for 300 years now floated as broken enemy hulls stretching across 1,000,000 kilometers of dark space. General Cole stepped beside her, quiet, watching the same field with the tired eyes of a man who had spent his career waiting for a single afternoon. 300 years of letting a story do the work an army usually has to do, he said. So the galaxy would leave us alone long enough to become something worth fearing properly. They won't leave us alone now, Ape said. Not after this. No, Cole agreed. But now they'll fear the truth instead of the rumor. That's a different kind of peace, one we can actually build on. 18 hours after the last shot was fired, Ape stood before a podium in a briefing room, cameras from colonies across human space trained on her, billions watching a broadcast that would rewrite everything they thought they understood about their own history. For 300 years, she began, the story you were told about the last Threxil War was incomplete. Today, that incompleteness ended because it had done exactly what it was built to do. A reporter in the front row raised a hand before she finished. Admiral, are you saying our own ancestors deceived generations of their own descendants? Yes, Ape said, without hesitation. They did, and the anger that answer deserves is fair. But every decision made inside the Long Watch was made with one goal, to make sure that if this day ever came, as few of you as possible would have to bury someone because of it. The room fell quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a truth too large to argue with immediately. How many people knew the full scope of it? Another reporter asked. At any given time, a few 100,000 out of a population spread across dozens of worlds, Ape said. Most of them are gone now, having spent entire lives building something they were told might never be needed. General Cole stepped up beside her, his voice steady despite his age. I was recruited at 19, he said. I am 81 now. I have spent my entire adult life guarding a secret I hoped I would carry to my grave without ever needing it. I am glad more than I can express that it mattered. A third reporter, younger than the others, asked the question that would end up quoted more than any other line from the broadcast. Admiral, do you regret the 300 years of silence, given everything it cost the people who kept it? Ape considered the question longer than any other that day. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I do not regret that we were ready. Those are two different things, and I think it matters that people understand the difference. Across human space, in colonies that had spent generations quietly wondering why the Threxil border had never once been tested, the full story began to spread. Descendants of the officers who had built the Long Watch finally learned what their grandparents had spent decades pretending was ordinary infrastructure work. In a modest home on New Meridian, a retired shipyard technician named Daniel Wren watched the broadcast with his granddaughter beside him, tears in his eyes that he made no attempt to hide. Grandpa, she said quietly, finally understanding, this is what you built. This is what we all built, he said. I only ever welded one small piece of it. He reached for her hand, and for the first time in decades, said the words he had never been permitted to say out loud. We were never as small as the legend let them believe, he said, not for one single day. In the days that followed, salvage crews moved through the wreckage field methodically, cataloging captured Threxil hulls, recovering the fallen on both sides, and beginning the slow work of learning everything the enemy's broken technology could teach them. Fleet Commander Priya Nakamura stood at a memorial wall being assembled in the same hidden shipyard she had launched from days earlier, watching technicians etch the names of the crew who had not returned. "Doesn't feel like a small number," she said quietly, "even if it was smaller than we planned for." "It never will," an older officer beside her said, a woman who had served the project for decades without ever expecting to see it used. "That's not a flaw in the plan. That's just what it costs to keep a promise this large." Nakamura nodded, reading the names, wondering how many more walls like this one existed across human space, each one holding a piece of the same 3-century silence. She thought of her own instructors, most of them retired now, who had spent entire careers training pilots for a mission they themselves would never fly. She wondered how many of them were watching the broadcasts today, finally allowed to feel proud of work they had never been permitted to discuss. "I hope they're watching," she said. "They are," the older officer beside her said, "every one of them." Fleet Captain Eidhen, meanwhile, oversaw the transfer of Sarix Val and the other captured Threxil crew to a newly established diplomacy station, the first of its kind, built specifically for a future no one had been certain would ever arrive. "What happens to them now?" a junior officer asked him. "That depends on what the hierarchy does next," Eidhen said. "But for now they're treated early. That was always part of the plan too. We didn't spend 3 centuries building strength just to become the thing we were preparing to face." Sarix, watching New Meridian's pale curve through a viewport for the first time since his capture, found himself unable to reconcile the mercy he had been shown with everything his empire had taught him to expect from a defeated enemy. It was a question he suspected he would carry for the rest of his life, and he was not alone in that. Every surviving Threxil officer now made prisoner across the system carried some version of the same unanswered question. A human researcher, assigned to document captured crew testimonies for the historical record, sat across from Sarix in a quiet interview room days after his capture. "You keep the same warning we do," she said, reading from a translated file. "Never wake a sleeping human fleet. Your grandmother taught it to you the same way our own children are taught certain warnings about strangers or fire." "I always thought it was just a story to keep children cautious," Sarix said. "I never imagined it was simply true." "Most warnings that survive for centuries are true," she said. "That's usually why they survive. The ones that aren't true get forgotten within a generation or two." Sarix said nothing for a long while, turning that over in his mind, the weight of 300 years of dismissed folklore settling somewhere he suspected it would stay for the rest of his life. Far from the battle, on the hierarchy's ancient capital world, members of the War Council received the first fragmentary reports in real time, relayed across the void by systems built for exactly this kind of emergency. Counselor Vekra Asan, eldest member of the council and veteran of countless prior conquests, read the casualty figures twice before speaking. "Confirm this number," she said. 15,000 ships is not a battle. It is the largest single loss in hierarchy history." "Confirmed, Counselor," an aide said. "Grand Overseer Thorn is currently leading the surviving remnant back toward hierarchy space." Asan set down the report and sat in silence for a long moment, the first silence the council chamber had held in living memory. 300 years, she finally said. "We taught our children a rule, and somewhere along the way we forgot to teach ourselves to actually obey it." A younger counselor, one of the few in the chamber born after the last major Threxil conquest, broke the silence with a question no one wanted to hear. "If this species has been ahead of us in secret for 300 years, he said, "how do we know today was not simply the smallest fraction of what they possess?" No one in the chamber had an answer. 3 centuries of doctrine had prepared them for every kind of war except the one that had just found them. Send envoys, another counselor suggested. Quietly, propose terms before we test them a second time and learn an even harder lesson. Asan rose slowly from her seat, feeling the weight of 300 years pressing down on a decision she had never expected to make. Send them, she said finally, and begin drafting contingency plans for every border system within reach of human space. Whatever this species intends to do next, the hierarchy will not be caught unprepared again. No one in the chamber believed that promise completely, not even the woman who made it. On Asenath, the young archivist Farron Dale watched the same broadcasts as everyone else, and pulled up her own unopened note from the night before the invasion, still sitting untouched in her supervisor's queue. Has anyone actually verified this was superstition, or did we just decide it was easier to believe? She stared at it a long time, then forwarded it to the War Council directly, bypassing every layer of approval that had ignored it the first time. It was opened within the hour. It changed nothing about the battle already fought, but it was, for the first time in 3 centuries, actually read. Across the hierarchy's 900 conquered systems, subject species who had lived under its rule for generations began hearing the story in fragments, then in full, then in versions that grew larger with each retelling. A species the hierarchy had taught its own children to fear had broken an invasion fleet in an afternoon and let the survivors carry the story home themselves. For the first time in living memory across those 900 systems, someone began to ask a question the hierarchy had spent 3 centuries making sure no one asked. If humanity could do this, who else might be sleeping quietly, waiting, counting down centuries of their own patience? On a mining colony deep within hierarchy territory, an old resistance leader named Corvin Ash gathered his surviving council in a room they had not used for open planning in over a decade. We always believed there was no one strong enough to stand against the hierarchy, he told the We were wrong. There is at least one. Perhaps that means we were wrong about more than we realized. No decisions were made that night. But for the first time in 3 centuries, hope moved through hierarchy space at the same speed as fear, and no one in the council chamber had a plan for stopping it. Aboard the fleeing absolute judgment, Grand Overseer Kaelith Thorn stared at the empty stars ahead, damage reports scrolling past him unread, and spoke the only words that mattered to the recorder capturing his official account. "Tell the council," he said, "the humans were never sleeping out of weakness." He closed his eyes, the weight of 300 years of certainty breaking quietly behind them. They were resting between the only 2 moments that would ever matter, the one they won 300 years ago and this one. Somewhere in hierarchy space, 3 centuries of unbroken conquest paused, for the first time, on a single report, carried by a broken fleet, spoken by a defeated commander who had once dismissed his own grandmother's warning as a bedtime story. The legend was no longer a legend. Beyond the wreckage field, beyond the memorial walls still being carved with names, beyond the councils on both sides now rewriting centuries of doctrine in a single week, one truth settled quietly over both empires, understood without needing to be spoken aloud. The galaxy had believed for 300 years that a sleeping enemy was a weak one. Humanity had proven, in a single afternoon, that some things sleep not because they lack strength, but because they have already decided exactly how much of it they intend to spend, and on what. No one on New Meridian knew yet what the hierarchy's envoys would propose, or whether the peace being drafted in distant chambers would hold. No one knew whether the 900 conquered systems now whispering humanity's name would find the courage to act on the hope that name had given them. What they did know was simpler, and for now it was enough. The rule had been broken. The fleet was no longer asleep. And for the first time in 300 years, An empire that had taught its children a warning it never fully understood finally learned exactly why the warning had been written. Beneath New Meridian's surface, Ache finally allowed herself to sit down, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders all at once. Cole sat beside her, saying nothing for a long while, two people who had spent their careers preparing for a single afternoon that had finally, at last, arrived and passed. "What happens tomorrow?" Ape asked eventually. "Tomorrow," Cole said, "we start building whatever comes after the legend. That part we never got to plan for." She almost smiled at that. "Good," she said. "I was getting tired of following a 300-year-old script." Outside, above the colony, an ordinary dawn began to break across a sky indifferent to everything that had changed beneath it, and everything still waiting to be decided. Somewhere in that new light, a species that had let a single old legend do its work for 3 centuries finally stood, in full view of the galaxy, exactly as large as it had always quietly been. And somewhere in a Threxil nursery, an old warning was already being rewritten, whispered by a parent to a child too young to understand what it now truly meant. Never wake a sleeping human fleet. They had finally learned the ending the story never told them. It had never been asleep at all. Phase 7 complete.